The message arrived on a Tuesday. It came not as words, not as threats, not as the grand war declarations that humanity had imagined for centuries. It came as a spreadsheet. A simple, clean, perfectly formatted file that appeared on every screen on Earth at exactly the same moment. Phones, tablets, monitors, the massive display boards in Times Square, the old television sets in rural villages that still ran on antennas. Every screen, every country, every person. The file had two columns. On the left, the Valori Dominion. On the right, humanity. And in every single row, the numbers told the same story. Warships, Valori, 1.2 million. Humanity, 11,400. Ground soldiers, Valori, 90 billion across their empire. Humanity, 8 million active military. Energy output, resource reserves, manufacturing capacity, territorial reach. The Valori held a minimum ratio of 100-1 in every category. In some categories, it was worse. No greeting, no demand. Just numbers. The Valori did not need to say what the numbers meant. The numbers said everything by themselves. Admiral Han Do-hyun was sitting in the United Earth Council chamber when the file appeared on the central display. He watched the rows fill the screen one by one. Around him, the representatives of every nation on Earth sat frozen. Some had gone pale. A few had their hands over their mouths. The delegate from Brazil was quietly crying. No one spoke for nearly 2 full minutes. Then, Do-hyun stood up. He was not a tall man. He was not a loud man. He had a calm face and steady hands and eyes that never seemed to blink when something important was happening. He looked at the screen, looked at the numbers, and said, "Good. Now we know the number." That was all he said. He walked out of the chamber. Within the hour, he made one phone call. Yoon Nari was in the middle of a lecture when her phone rang. She was teaching a class on historical military strategy at the Naval Academy in Jinhae. 32 students sat in front of her, most of them looking at their own phones, reading the Valori file, their faces blank with the kind of fear that had no name yet. Nari glanced at her phone, saw the caller, and ended the lecture without explanation. She picked up the call in the hallway. Do-hyun's voice was the same as always. No urgency, no drama. He said, "I need you to come to the planning center. I need 100 plans, each one independent. No plan can rely on another plan succeeding. If 99 fail, the 100th must still work on its own." Nari was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, "How long do we have?" "They gave us 30 cycles. Our analysts think that translates to roughly 31 Earth days. That is not a lot of time." "No," Do-hyun agreed, "it is not." She went back into the classroom, looked at her students, and told them that class was canceled for the rest of the semester. One student, a young man in the back row, asked if the world was ending. Nari considered the question seriously, and then said, "Not if I can help it." She packed her bag and left. The planning center was a bunker built into the rock beneath the Yellow Sea. It had been constructed decades ago for a war between nations that never came. Now it would be used for a war between species. Nari arrived to find a team of 40 people already assembled. Analysts, engineers, tacticians, linguists, even a few civilian scientists who had been pulled from universities without much explanation. They looked at her with the same expression her students had worn. Fear, but also something else. A need to be told what to do. Nari pinned the Valori census data to the wall, every number, every ratio. Then, she picked up a marker and wrote across the top, "They are bigger, they are stronger, they have more. So what?" She turned to the room and explained her approach. They would not try to match the Valori. That was impossible, and everyone in the room knew it. They would not try to find one brilliant strategy that would win the war in a single stroke. That was a fantasy. Instead, they would create 100 separate plans. Each plan would target a different weakness, exploit a different angle, cause a different kind of problem. Some plans would be military, some would be diplomatic, some would be psychological, some would be so strange that the Valori would not even recognize them as acts of war. The goal, Nari said, is not to defeat an empire. The goal is to become the most expensive meal they have ever tried to eat. Work began immediately. Meanwhile, in orbit above Earth, Shin Haiyang was already moving. Haiyang was the chief engineer of Orbital Station Mugunghwa, a battered construction platform that had been building civilian ships for the last 12 years. She had seen the Valori numbers like everyone else. Unlike most people, she did not freeze. She opened her toolkit, called her engineering crew to the main bay, and started stripping the station. She pulled out luxury components first: the artificial gravity plating in the recreation rooms, the decorative hull panels, the water recycling system's backup filters. Her crew watched her with confusion. One of them asked what she was building. Haiyang said she did not know yet. But she knew she would need parts, and parts were what she had. By the end of the first day, she had filled 2 cargo bays with raw materials and components. She had a feeling that someone would need what she was building before she even knew what it was. On the ground, Quan Taesung received his orders through a secure channel. Taesung was a ground commander, a large, quiet man who had grown up on a rice farm before joining the military. He read his orders twice. Then he called his unit together and told them to pack farming equipment: shovels, plows, seed drills, and 24 autonomous tractors. His soldiers looked at him like he had lost his mind. He told them they were going to dig, and that what they buried today would save lives in 3 weeks. They did not fully believe him, but they followed him anyway. They always did. On the 5th night, Nari finished the first 10 plans. She saved them in a folder and stared at the label field for a long time before typing 2 words: acceptable losses. She closed the folder. Then she opened a new one and typed unacceptable victories. She worked until her eyes burned. She slept for 3 hours on the floor of the bunker. Then she woke up and started Plan 11. Above the Earth, the Valori observation ship sat in high orbit and watched. It recorded the movement of human ships, the communications traffic, the energy output of cities and stations. Everything it saw confirmed what the Dominion already knew. Humanity was small. Humanity was weak. Humanity was afraid. The observation ship filed its report and moved on. It did not notice the old cargo ships beginning to fly strange routes through the asteroid belt. It did not notice the tractors digging on the moons. It did not notice the engineer stripping her station to the bones. It did not notice because it was not looking for any of those things. The Valori had conquered 400 species. Not one of them had ever done anything worth noticing after receiving the count. Humanity was going to be different. The Valori just did not know it yet. By the 8th day, Nari had completed 41 plans. She had not left the bunker. She slept in 2-hour bursts on a cot pushed against the wall, ate cold rice from containers that someone left outside her door, and drank so much coffee that her hands trembled when she wrote. Her team worked in shifts around her, but Nari did not work in shifts. She simply worked. Each plan lived in its own folder. Each folder had a name. Some names were practical: Fog of Peace, Broken Mirror, Long Arm. Some were strange: Loudmouth, Paperfleet, Ghost Chorus. One was called Bitter Seed, and when her deputy read it, he looked at Nari with something between admiration and horror. She told him to stop reading and start preparing. The plans spread outward from the bunker like roots from a tree. Each one reached a different person, a different branch of humanity's scattered forces, a different corner of the solar system. And each one asked its people to do something that looked, from the outside, completely ordinary. Plan 7 was called Fog of Peace. Nari sent orders to every civilian cargo company still operating in the solar system. She did not ask them to fight. She did not ask them to carry weapons. She asked them to fly. Specifically, she asked them to fly constantly, on random routes, crossing and recrossing the same shipping lanes, changing course without pattern, flooding every corridor of space between Earth and the outer planets with traffic. Hundreds of cargo ships, moving in every direction, creating a cloud of engine signatures and radar contacts so thick that no sensor array can sort military ships from commercial ones. The cargo captains did not fully understand why. Nari did not explain. She simply told them that every hour they spent flying was an hour they were protecting their families. Most of them believed her. The ones who did not still flew, because there was nothing else to do. Plan 14 was Bitter Seed, and it belonged to Quan Taesung. By the 10th day, Taesung and his soldiers had dug over 300 underground caches across the surface of Mars colony, 2 of Jupiter's moons, and the mining settlements on Ceres. Each cache contained autonomous weapon platforms, small turrets, sensor pods, and communication relays, all sealed in waterproof containers and buried beneath 2 meters of soil. The digging was done with farming equipment. The tractors that carved the holes were standard agricultural models, the same ones used to prepare fields for planting. From orbit, from any sensor, the work looked exactly like what it was: farming. The Valori scanned for military construction. They scanned for weapon signatures, for bunker architecture, for the electromagnetic patterns of defensive installations. They did not scan for plowed fields. Taesung supervised every burial personally. He walked the rows of turned earth with his hands behind his back, looking for all the world like a farmer inspecting his crops. His soldiers, who had thought he was crazy 2 weeks ago, now understood. They were planting a harvest that would grow teeth. Plan 31 was Paper Fleet, and it was Shin Hayoung's masterpiece. From the stripped bones of Station Mugunghwa and 3 decommissioned cargo platforms, Hayoung built 214 fake ships. They had no engines that could move them in battle. They had no weapons. They had no crews. What they had was radar reflectors tuned to match the signatures of Earth's real warships, heat emitters that mimicked engine output, and communication modules that broadcast standard fleet chatter on military frequencies. From a distance, and the Valori would be at a distance, at least at first, each fake ship looked exactly like a real one. Hayoung launched them in waves, spreading them across orbits that mirrored real fleet formations. She programmed them to drift and adjust position in patterns that looked like patrol routes. She even gave them names, assigning each one a false registry number that matched the naming system of Earth's actual navy. If the Valori checked their databases, they would find ship names, service records, and crew manifests. All fake, all perfect, all built by Hayoung's team in 72 sleepless hours. When Nari reviewed the Paper Fleet data, she sent Hayoung a single message: "You are terrifying." Hayoung sent back, "I know." Plan 55 was different from all the others. It had no weapons, no decoys, no tricks. It was called the Handshake, and it belonged to Admiral Han Do-hyun personally. The Valori Dominion ruled over dozens of conquered species. Most had surrendered immediately upon receiving the count. A few had fought and been destroyed. All of them now served the Dominion as vassal races, providing labor, resources, and obedience in exchange for being allowed to continue existing. Among these vassal species were the Tohari, a small, quiet civilization that managed communication relays and logistical routing for the Valori fleet. The Tohari had never been offered anything by the Dominion except survival. They had never been asked what they wanted. They had never sat at a table where their voice mattered. Do-hyun changed that. Through a series of carefully hidden transmissions routed through civilian channels, he opened a private conversation with a Tohari administrator. He did not ask for military help. He did not ask for sabotage. He simply asked the Tohari what they wanted, and then He listened. The conversation lasted 4 days. At the end of it, Do-hyun made a single promise. If humanity survived this, the Tohari would have a seat at whatever table came next. Not under it, at it. The Tohari administrator did not make any promises in return. But she did not close the channel either. While all of this was happening, Captain Baek Ji-sek was alone. The stealth frigate Gwangaeto was the smallest combat ship in Earth's fleet. It carried a crew of 19 and enough supplies for 40 days. Ji-sek had taken it past the Valori observation line on the 7th day, slipping through a gap in their sensor coverage that existed because the Valori had not bothered to close it. Why would they? No human ship had ever gone deeper into Valori-controlled space. There was no reason to expect one would. Ji-sek spent 12 days mapping the Valori supply chain. He tracked fuel transports, ammunition convoys, communication relay ships, and the massive factory vessels that produced replacement parts for the fleet. He recorded schedules, routes, security rotations, and response times. He noted which routes were heavily guarded and which were not. And he found something that changed everything. The Valori fleet was enormous. Its supply chain was not. The Dominion had conquered so many species so quickly that it had never needed to build a supply system designed for long wars. Their logistics were built for short campaigns. Arrive, overwhelm, occupy, move on. The fuel depots were centralized. The ammunition stores were not well defended because no one had ever attacked them. The communication relays depended on Tohari operators who followed routines that had not been updated in decades. The Valori war machine was a giant with thin ankles. Ji-seok compressed his findings into a single encrypted data burst and sent it back to Nari. It arrived in the bunker at 3 in the morning. Nari was awake, of course. She read it twice. Then she opened Plan 44 and began rewriting it with new coordinates. On the 28th day, 2 days before the Valori deadline, Nari finished Plan 100. She called Do-hyun and told him it was done. He asked her to describe the final plan. She said it had no tactical details, no fleet movements, no weapons. The entire document was a single page. It read, "If all 99 plans fail, we make sure they remember that we existed. We broadcast everything, our history, our music, our faces, our names, on every frequency, to every corner of the galaxy, so that whoever comes after us knows that a species called humanity lived here, and that we did not go quietly." Do-hyun was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Send it to me. I will sign it." He signed it that night. Then he went to the bridge of his flagship, looked out at the stars, and waited. The Valori arrived the next morning. 12,000 ships, arranged in perfect formation, blotting out the sun. They expected to find a species ready to surrender. They had no idea what they had found instead. The Valori vanguard entered the solar system like a wall moving through water. 12,000 ships in layered formation, each one larger than anything humanity had ever built, each one carrying enough firepower to turn a city into glass. They moved with the slow confidence of a force that had never been stopped. Their formation was textbook. Their approach vector was standard. Their communication channels hummed with the calm, routine chatter of professionals doing a job they had done many times before. On the bridge of the flagship Daejeon, Admiral Han Do-hyun watched them come. The tactical display showed the Valori fleet as a red tide sweeping inward from the edge of the system. Earth's fleet, the real fleet, not the paper ghosts, was a thin blue line. 120 ships against 12,000. The display looked like a joke. Do-hyun opened a channel to Yoon-Nari in the bunker beneath the Yellow Sea. "They are here," he said. "I know," Nari replied. Her voice was flat and focused, the voice of someone who had already moved past fear into something colder. "Begin with Plan 3. Plan 3 was called Broken Mirror, and it was designed to look like a mistake. Do-hyun ordered the fleet forward. 120 ships moved to meet 12,000. The Valori commander, whose name was later learned to be something that translated roughly as Fleet Keeper, noted the human advance with mild interest. The ratio was 100 to 1. The humans were either brave or stupid. It did not matter which. The two fleets closed distance. Earth ships opened fire first, a ragged, uncoordinated volley that struck the Valori's forward shields and did almost nothing. The Valori returned fire with precise, measured shots. 3 human ships were destroyed in the first exchange. Then, as if panicking, the human fleet broke formation and scattered in every direction. The Valori pursued. This was standard. A broken enemy fleet was easy to hunt. Individual ships could be run down and destroyed one by one. The fleet keeper divided his forces into pursuit groups and sent them after the fleeing human ships. This was exactly what Nari wanted. The human ships were not fleeing randomly. Each one followed a precise course calculated weeks earlier, threading through regions of space that looked empty on Valori sensors. These regions were not empty. Shin Ha-young had spent 10 days seeding them with micromines, devices no larger than a fist, built from stripped station components, each one carrying a shaped charge designed not to destroy a ship, but to damage it, crack a hull plate, shatter a sensor array, rupture a fuel line. The Valori pursuit groups flew into the minefields at full speed. The explosions were small. Individually, each mine was barely a threat. But there were thousands of them, and the Valori ships hit them in clusters. 400 ships took damage in the first 8 minutes. Cracked hulls, blinded sensors, leaking fuel. None were destroyed. That was not the point. The point was that for the first time in the campaign, the Valori fleet was bleeding. The fleet keeper ordered an immediate halt and regrouping. His officers reported the damage with confusion in their voices. Mines were a primitive weapon. No advanced species used them. The Valori had not even scanned for them because they had not considered the possibility. While the Valori regrouped, Nari activated Plan 22. Across the solar system, Ha-young's paper fleet came alive. 214 decoy ships powered up simultaneously, broadcasting engine signatures, heat patterns, and fleet communications that were identical to real warships. The Valori sensor network, which had been tracking 120 human ships, suddenly showed over 1,300. The fleet keeper stared at his tactical display. The numbers did not make sense. Where had these ships come from? Were they hidden? Were they reinforcements from a colony the Dominion had not detected? His intelligence officers scrambled to analyze the new contacts, trying to separate real ships from false ones. The analysis was slow because the decoys were good. Ha-young had built them to survive exactly this kind of scrutiny. Every minute the Valori spent analyzing was a minute they were not advancing. The fleet keeper made his first mistake. He slowed the entire operation to wait for the analysis. In 400 previous conquests, the Valori had never needed to pause on the first day. On Mars Colony, the ground invasion began. Valori troop transports descended through the thin atmosphere and landed in the flat plains east of the main settlement. 10,000 Valori soldiers disembarked in perfect order, established a perimeter, and began advancing toward the colony structures. Kwon Tae-sung watched them from a ridge 2 kilometers away. He had 50 soldiers with him, plus 300 colonists who had volunteered to fight with whatever they had. Against 10,000 Valori troops, his force was meaningless. He did not plan to use it. He let the Valori land. He let them form up. He let them march forward with their weapons ready and their formations tight. He let them walk directly over the fields he had plowed 3 weeks ago. Then he entered a code into his command tablet. Beneath the Valori soldiers' feet, 300 buried caches activated simultaneously. Autonomous turrets punched through the soil like metal flowers, blooming. and opened fire. Sensor pods mapped every Valori position and fed targeting data to the turrets in real time. Communication jammers flooded local frequencies with noise, cutting the Valori ground forces off from their ships in orbit. The Valori had landed on a minefield that looked like a farm. The turrets were not powerful enough to win a sustained battle. Taesung knew that. But for 11 chaotic minutes, the Valori ground forces were pinned, confused, and taking casualties from enemies they could not see. By the time they destroyed the last turret, Taesung and his people were already gone, moving through tunnels that the colonists had dug using the same farming equipment that had buried the caches. The Valori secured the colony. They held the ground. But they had lost soldiers, in real numbers, to weapons hidden inside grain silos and buried under crop rows. The ground commander sent a report to the fleet keeper, requesting updated intelligence on human military capabilities. The report that came back contained a phrase that had never appeared in a Valori intelligence document before. No consistent doctrine identified. The Valori could not figure out what humanity was doing, because humanity was not doing one thing. It was doing everything. In orbit, the fleet keeper received the analysis of the new ship contacts. 60% were confirmed as decoys, but 40% could not be classified with certainty. That meant somewhere between 120 and 500 human warships were still operational, and the Valori could not tell which contacts were real. The fleet keeper was not afraid. He was too experienced for fear. But he was, for the first time in his career, uncertain. He had expected this campaign to last 3 days. It was now day 1, and he had already lost 400 ships to damage, an unknown number of ground troops to buried weapons, and his sensor network's ability to accurately count the enemy. He sent a message to Dominion High Command. Resistance is greater than projected. Request updated intelligence package. High Command sent back a single line. Proceed as planned. No species rated below threshold has ever required adjustment. The fleet keeper read the message and said nothing. He turned back to his display, where 1,300 contacts, some real, some ghosts, blinked steadily in the dark. Far behind the Valori lines, in the cold space between stars, Captain Baek Ji-seok sat in the cockpit of the Gwanggaedo and watched his communication panel. He had received Nari's reply to his intelligence report. It contained new orders and a set of coordinates. The coordinates pointed to the Valori fleet's primary fuel depot, a massive station 3 systems away, lightly defended because no enemy had ever reached it. Ji-seok read the orders twice. Then he smiled, a small, sharp smile that his crew had learned to be nervous about, and set a new course. Back in the bunker, Nari crossed off plans 3 and 22. She opened a new file, typed Plan 44, long arm, and began writing the next act. 30 days had become 29. The war had just started, and humanity, outmatched 100 to 1, had just made the Valori pause. It was not much, but it was a beginning. By day 10, the Valori had taken Mars Colony, 2 lunar settlements, and the outer ring of orbital stations around Earth. By every standard measure, they were winning. Their fleet still outnumbered humanity's by an enormous margin. Their ground forces held every position they had captured. Their supply lines stretched back through 3 systems without a single interruption. And yet, something was wrong. The fleet keeper could feel it the way a sailor feels a change in the current before the storm arrives. Nothing was broken. Nothing had failed. But everything was slightly harder than it should have been. Ships were a fraction slower. Communications took a beat longer to arrive. Fuel consumption reports showed numbers that did not quite match projections. Each problem was small. Each problem was nothing. Together, they were something. He did not know it yet, but he was feeling the weight of 74 plans. Plan 44 struck on day 11. Captain Baek Ji-seok brought the Gwanggaedo out of silent running 3,000 kilometers from the Valori primary fuel depot. The depot was a massive orbital structure, fat and slow, surrounded by fuel tankers waiting to be loaded. It was defended by 12 patrol ships, enough to stop pirates or raiders, not enough to stop someone who knew exactly where every patrol would be at every moment of the day. Jisok knew. He had mapped their routes personally. The Guangato slipped through a gap in the patrol pattern that lasted exactly 90 seconds. Jisok's weapons officer fired 4 torpedoes. They were not standard warheads. Shin Ha-young had designed them specifically for this mission. Instead of explosives, they carried a chemical payload that would dissolve into the depot's fuel reserves and degrade their energy output by 15%. The fuel would still work. The ships that used it would still fly. But every system they powered, engines, shields, weapons, sensors, would run slightly below capacity. The torpedoes struck the depot's fuel tanks and released their payload without any visible explosion. No fireball, no debris, no alarm. The patrol ships continued their routes. The depot continued its operations. No one noticed anything. Jisok pulled the Guangato back into silent running and vanished. The contaminated fuel began shipping to the Valori fleet within hours. Over the next 6 days, ship after ship refueled with degraded energy cells. Performance dropped across the entire armada. Shield strength fell. Engine response times increased. Weapon cycling rates slowed. The Valori engineers ran diagnostics and found nothing wrong with their systems. The systems were fine. The fuel was not. By the time they traced the problem, 6 days had passed, and 2/3 of the fleet was running on poisoned fuel. Flushing and replacing it would take weeks. They did not have weeks. The fleet keeper ordered the fleet to continue operations at reduced capacity and filed the incident as an anomaly. It was not an anomaly. It was Plan 44. On day 13, Plan 55 began to bloom. The Tohari, the quiet vassal species that Admiral Han Du-hyun had been speaking with for weeks, did not rebel. They did not sabotage. They did something much more subtle. They made mistakes. Communication relays managed by Tohari operators began introducing tiny delays. A message that should arrive in 2 seconds took 4. Coordinates were transposed, not dramatically, just enough to send a patrol ship to the wrong sector for an hour before the error was caught. Scheduling data for supply convoys shifted by small amounts, causing ships to arrive at depots that had not yet loaded their cargo. Each mistake was small enough to be explained as routine error. The Tohari had been managing Valori communications for decades. Errors happened. But the errors were increasing in frequency, and they always seemed to affect the operations around Earth's solar system. The Valori logistics officers noted the pattern, but could not prove intent. The Tohari operators apologized politely each time and corrected the errors promptly. They were helpful. They were cooperative. They were slowly pulling threads from the fabric of the Valori war machine, one at a time. Plan 61 was called Loudmouth, and it was perhaps the strangest weapon Nari had designed. On day 15, every Valori tactical frequency in the solar system was suddenly flooded with human transmissions. Not jamming signals, not static. Music, poetry, historical speeches, old radio broadcasts, children's songs, comedy recordings from the 20th century, a full reading of a novel about a man and a whale. The broadcast was continuous, layered, and loud. The Valori could still communicate. They simply had to switch to encrypted backup channels, which required more processing power and introduced lag into their command structure. Every time they secured a new frequency, the humans found it and filled it with noise within hours. The Valori communications officers spent more time managing their own networks than monitoring the enemy. The broadcast served a second purpose that Nari had not written into the plan, but had hoped for. Across the Valori fleet, soldiers and officers began hearing human voices for the first time, not as threats, not as demands, but as music and stories and laughter. It did not make them sympathetic, but it made humanity real in a way that the census data never had. It is harder to exterminate a species after you have heard their children singing. On the ground, Quan Taesung was fighting a war that had no front lines. After the initial ambush on Mars, Taesung never engaged the Valori directly again. He moved his forces, now swollen with volunteers from every colony, through tunnels, maintenance corridors, and underground transit systems. He struck supply depots, communication relays, landing zones, and sensor installations. He hit a target, caused damage, and was gone before the Valori response teams arrived. He never held territory. He never defended a position. He never fought a battle he could not walk away from. The Valori responded by committing more troops to guard their holdings. Every soldier assigned to guard duty was a soldier not advancing. Every patrol watching a supply depot was a patrol not hunting Taesung. He was a single man with a few hundred fighters, and he was tying down thousands of Valori soldiers simply by existing. The Valori ground commander called him a pest. Taesung would have taken that as a compliment. By day 20, the fleet keeper was facing a situation he had never encountered. His fleet was still larger. His forces still held more territory. His firepower was still superior by every metric. But his fuel was degraded. His communications were unreliable. His sensor data was polluted with ghost contacts he could not clear. His supply convoys kept arriving at the wrong place at the wrong time. His ground forces were spending more energy defending what they held than taking new ground. And somewhere behind his lines, a stealth ship he could not find was still operating. He was winning, but winning was costing more than it should. On day 22, the fleet keeper sent a message to Dominion High Command requesting reinforcements. Not because he needed them to win. He was certain he could still win with what he had. But because the campaign was falling behind schedule, and reinforcements would allow him to finish quickly and move on. High Command denied the request. The message was brief and carried the unmistakable tone of displeasure. The Valori Dominion did not send reinforcements to campaigns against species rated below threshold. Doing so would imply that the species was a genuine threat. It would set a precedent. It would raise questions. Other vassal species might notice. The fleet keeper read the denial and understood its meaning perfectly. He was expected to win with what he had, or face the consequences of not winning. There would be no help. He closed the message and turned back to his tactical display. The ghost contacts still blinked. The communication channels still hummed with human music. The fuel readings were still wrong. In the bunker, Nari crossed off Plan 71. She had used 74 of the 100 plans. Some had worked beautifully. Some had failed completely. Some had produced results she had not expected. But every single one had cost the Valori something. Time, fuel, attention, confidence. The Great Fleet had not been defeated. It had been taxed, drained, irritated, worn down by 100 small cuts that no single plan could have inflicted alone. Do-hyun called her that evening. He asked how many plans they had left. She said 26. He asked how many they needed. She paused, and when she spoke, her voice was tired but steady. "We do not need to win," she said. "We need them to decide that we are not worth it." Do-hyun considered this. Then he asked, "And if they decide we are worth it?" Nari did not answer immediately. When she did, she said, "Then we use Plan 100, and we make sure the galaxy remembers our names." Neither of them spoke for a moment after that. Then Do-hyun said, "Get some sleep, Nari." She did not sleep. She opened Plan 75 and began working. There were 9 days left. On the morning of day 27, Nari did something that no strategist in the history of war had ever done. She told the enemy everything. Plan 82 was called Open Book. At exactly 600 hours, Earth Standard Time, Every Valori ship in the solar system received a transmission. It was not encrypted, it was not hidden. It was broadcast in the clear, on open frequencies, in the Valori language, formatted to their standard military document specifications. It was a complete summary of all 100 plans. Every plan, every name, every objective. The ones that had worked, the ones that had failed, the ones that were still running, and the 18 that had not yet been activated. The document began with a single line. You have seen 82 of these. You stopped 30. Here are the remaining 18. They are already in motion. The fleet keeper read the document in his command center, alone, standing perfectly still. His officers waited behind him, watching his face for a reaction. He gave them nothing. He read each plan summary carefully, from the first to the last. The 18 remaining plans were described in enough detail to be credible. Each one targeted a different vulnerability in the Valori operation. Each one would require significant resources to counter. Then he reached Plan 100. It had no tactical details, no fleet movements, no weapons. It was a single paragraph. If all 99 plans fail, we will transmit the complete record of this war to every inhabited system in the galaxy. Every species under Valori rule will receive the full account of how a civilization outnumbered 100 to 1 fought for 30 days and made the Dominion bleed. We will make sure that every conquered people knows what resistance looks like, not because it will save us, because it will make sure the next species to receive the count knows that the count is not the end of the story. The fleet keeper read it twice. Then he set the document down and looked out the viewport at the blue planet below. He was not afraid of Plan 100. Plans like that were gestures, not weapons, but he understood what it meant. He understood that the species below him had built a plan for the specific purpose of losing in the most expensive way possible. They had prepared for their own destruction and turned even that into a weapon. For the first time in the campaign, the fleet keeper asked himself a question that had nothing to do with tactics. He asked himself, what kind of species prepares 100 ways to fight and makes the 100th plan a promise to haunt you even after they are gone? He did not have an answer. On day 28, the Tohari stopped pretending. The communication errors, the scheduling mistakes, the small delays, all of it had been deniable. Routine incompetence, system glitches. But on day 28, the Tohari communication operators across the Valori fleet simply stopped routing certain messages. Not all messages, just the ones related to fleet coordination in the Earth system. Resupply requests vanished. Tactical updates arrived hours late. Ground force requisitions were filed and never processed. The Valori logistics network did not collapse, but it stumbled, badly, at the worst possible moment. More importantly, the Tohari were not the only ones watching. The Valori Dominion controlled dozens of vassal species. Every one of them had received the count. Every one of them had surrendered. Every one of them had accepted that resistance was mathematically impossible. For generations, they had lived under Valori rule because the numbers said they had no choice. Now for 30 days, they had watched a species outnumbered 100 to 1 refuse to accept the math. They had watched the Valori fleet take damage. They had watched Valori soldiers die on a planet defended by weapons hidden in farmland. They had watched the mighty Dominion request reinforcements and be denied. They had watched, and they had started to think thoughts that the Dominion had spent centuries making sure no one ever thought. The Tohari were simply the first to act on those thoughts. They would not be the last. The fleet keeper understood the implications immediately. The Tohari defection was not militarily significant. A few communication delays would not change the outcome of the campaign. But if other vassal species followed, if the Dominion's entire logistics network began to fray, because conquered people suddenly believed resistance was possible, then this campaign would become the most expensive victory in Valori history, not because of what humanity had done, but because of what humanity had shown everyone else. On day 29, Admiral Han Do-hyun made his final move. He opened a direct communication channel to the Fleet Keeper's flagship, not through intermediaries, not through diplomatic protocols, a direct, open line, broadcast for every ship in both fleets to hear. The Fleet Keeper accepted the call. He did not know what to expect, a demand for terms perhaps, or a final defiant speech, or a plea for mercy. Do-hyun gave him none of those things. Instead, Do-hyun offered the Valori terms, not surrender terms, partnership terms, trade access to human space, non-aggression agreements, cultural exchange programs, technology sharing in civilian fields, a seat for the Valori, at a new diplomatic table that would include humanity, the Tohari, and any other species willing to sit down. Do-hyun spoke calmly, clearly, and without any trace of desperation. He spoke as if he were addressing an equal. He spoke as if the Valori fleet was not hovering above his planet with enough firepower to turn it into dust. He treated the Fleet Keeper not as a conqueror, but as a neighbor who had made a bad first impression and was now being given a chance to start over. The audacity of it was unlike anything the Fleet Keeper had ever experienced. He had been offered surrenders before. He had received threats and pleas and desperate bargains from doomed civilizations. He had never in 400 campaigns been offered a handshake by a species he was in the process of conquering. He muted the channel and sat in silence for a long time. Then he thought about the numbers. Not the original census. Those numbers still favored the Valori overwhelmingly. He thought about the new numbers, the ones that had accumulated over 30 days. 400 ships damaged in the minefields. Fuel efficiency down 15% across the fleet. Communications unreliable. Ground forces tied down guarding fixed positions. A stealth ship still operating behind his lines that he had never been able to find. 18 remaining human plans, each one requiring resources he could not spare. Vassal species watching and beginning to ask questions. And 100 plans. Not 100 weapons or 100 ships. 100 ideas, created by a species that knew it was going to lose, and decided to make losing so expensive that winning would feel like defeat. The Fleet Keeper did the math. He could still win. He was certain of that. His fleet could destroy Earth's remaining forces in a matter of days. But destroying the fleet would not end the underground war. Occupying the planets would not stop the buried weapons, the tunnels, the guerrilla fighters. Holding the territory would require a permanent garrison that would drain resources for years. And every day the occupation continued, every vassal species in the Dominion would be watching, learning, and thinking. The cost of victory was no longer measured in ships and soldiers. It was measured in what the Dominion would lose when every conquered species realized that the count could be beaten. On day 30, the Valori fleet withdrew. The official report to Dominion High Command described the action as a strategic reallocation of fleet resources to higher priority sectors. The report was professionally written, technically accurate, and entirely dishonest. Every species in the galaxy who read it knew what it really meant. The Valori had left because one small species had made staying too expensive. 6 months later, Nari was back at the Naval Academy in Jinhae. She had slept for 2 full weeks after the withdrawal, eaten real meals for the first time in a month, and returned to teaching with the same quiet intensity she brought to everything. Her students treated her with a mixture of respect and fear that she pretended not to notice. One afternoon, a student raised her hand and asked, "Professor Yoon, what would have happened if we had needed Plan 100? Nari set down her marker and looked at the student for a moment. The classroom was quiet. Through the windows, sunlight fell on rows of desks, on young faces, on a world that was still here because 100 plans had been enough. Plan 100 was never about what we would do if we lost. It was about making sure that even in losing, We changed the equation for everyone who came after us. We were not fighting for ourselves. We were fighting so that the next species to receive the count would know beyond any doubt that the count is not the end. It is just a number. What you do after you see it, that is what matters. The student nodded slowly. Nari picked up her marker and went back to the lesson. 1,000 light-years away, in a newly built station constructed from the salvage of war, Admiral Han Do-hyun sat across a table from a Tohari diplomat. They were not discussing weapons. They were not discussing territory. They were discussing trade routes, cultural exchanges, and the framework for a new alliance that would include any species willing to join. Behind them, through a wide viewport, a Valori cargo ship passed slowly through the station's traffic lane. It was carrying civilian goods. It had been cleared by both human and Tohari authorities. It flew peacefully, without escort, through space that had been a war zone half a year ago. Do-hyun watched it pass and said nothing. The Tohari diplomat noticed his gaze and asked if the sight troubled him. "No," Do-hyun said. "That is exactly what we fought for." The cargo ship disappeared into the black, and the two of them went back to work. The ratio had always been 100-1. Humanity did not change the ratio. Humanity changed what the one was worth. And the galaxy never forgot it.